Hello, this is another episode of Western Wisconsin Journal, and I'm Buck Malick of Hudson. Today we're going to talk about a really exciting event at the Hudson Area Joint Library on April 2nd in the evening, an author appearance. Let me ask the two guests to introduce themselves at this time, and then we'll get into some questions to draw out information about this appearance. Shelley?
I'm Shelley Tugis, and I'm the Adult and Youth Services Coordinator at the library, so I'm in charge of the programming that we do there, including the author visits. So I'm very excited to have Dave come with us.
Okay. And I'm Dave Evanson. I can't claim I'm the author. Gordon MacQuarrie is the author, but I am the editor and compiler of this new book we'll be talking about. And I've done a lot of Gordon MacQuarrie and Old Duck Hunter research.
Great. So those are our panelists. Let's dive into some of the meat of what's going on here. Dave, let me ask you to give the audience a little of your background, because you're a retired DNR guy.
Yeah. So I'm, as Buck said, I'm a retired DNR wildlife manager. My territory was the four-county area, Burnett, Washburn, Polk, and Barron County originally, and then as I moved up the ladder, it got to be everything in the north. But that includes some of the MacQuarrie area, so that's kind of how I got involved with MacQuarrie in my retirement.
Great. Shelley, this isn't the only author appearance at the library.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us about any other of them?
Yeah, sure. I'll mention the next two that we have coming up. We have Jim Gull on March 4th. He is a Hudson former engineer who's retired and been writing, and he wrote this beautiful coming-of-age novel set sort of during the Vietnam War about a boy whose father was murdered. So it's a beautiful, beautiful book, and we're excited to have him. On May 3rd, we have Nicholas Butler, who is another Wisconsin author, and we're going to do something we've never done before at the library. We're closing at 6 on Friday, our normal close time, but then we're reopening with adults only and doing a happy hour with author Nicholas Butler.
Oh.
So there will be free appetizers and a cash bar. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the part of Wisconsin that you worked in would be this.
The Indian head, yeah, I mean, you can see the
Part of
Indian head when
Wisconsin.
you hold it up there. And MacQuarrie, of course, was born in Superior, and his first area of exploring was close to Superior, mostly Douglas and Bayfield County, and that's where a lot of his work, or a lot of his stories come from, a lot of where his hunting and fishing happened. But also he got down into Washburn County and Burnett County quite a bit.
I'm sure that not to steal the thunder from your presentation on April 2nd, but I'm sure that a lot of our audience would be interested in knowing some of the specific details about MacQuarrie's life. He was born in Superior then in 1900, was it?
1900, yeah, it's easy always to keep track of. If in the book here I have a story that was written in 1937, you can picture in your mind, well, he was 37 years old, so this is how he would have been feeling and what would have been going on in his life. He was born in 1900. He went to school in Superior. He was a track star. He was a quarter miler and a pole vaulter, and he knew, I think, pretty early in his life that he wanted to be a journalist. So he went to school in Superior at it was normal school then, of course, and got 2 years, and then he went to Madison and got his journalism degree. And Madison had one of the first journalism schools. They would claim they were the first, but Missouri would claim maybe not. But anyway, that was he knew he needed a degree, and he came back to Superior actually even before he graduated, hooked up with the Superior Evening Telegram and started working there, went back and finished his degree, came back. And then the important thing in his life, or the important thing in all these books, I think, he married Helen Peck. And that led him further.
Yeah, and that led him to Mr. President, his honor, etc., right? Who was his father-in-law.
His father-in-law was Al Peck, and Al Peck is a character. And all the new book doesn't deal a whole lot with him, or as much as some of these, but all of the old duck hunter stories, the Old Duck Hunters Association, ODHA, Inc., and Inc. stands for?
Incorrigible.
Incorrigible, right. So they were the Old Duck Hunters Association Incorrigible. He didn't use ink all the time, but he used it when he needed to jab his father-in-law a little bit. And they hunted together, they fished together, they had a lot of fun, and he is a wordsmith. MacQuarrie was just a wonderful wordsmith. He's, you know, it's close to the heart. He was a deep thinker and a deep feeler, I would say. You know, I mean, he felt that outdoors so deeply. But he was a rascal too, and Mr. President really was a rascal. But they had fun.
Yeah. So you've alluded a bit to the books, and we probably ought to cover that a bit here. Here in Hudson, we happen to be the home of the gentleman who wrote the definitive biography of Gordon MacQuarrie, and that's Keith Crowley, right? You know Keith, and Keith did himself personally the research necessary to write this biography, right?
Yes. Yeah, Keith is, typically whenever anybody asks me how I got into this, I say I got to blame it all on Keith Crowley. That's a wonderful book. It's available through the library system. I don't know if you have a copy yourself, but it's certainly available through the system. You can order it. Yeah, you can order it easily, and I would recommend anybody that's watching this show tonight and is interested. Well, any one of these books is a good place to start, but that's a good place to be as well. So he did wonderful research in the book came out in 2003. And he did wonderful research in the pre-real computer world. I mean, that was in the 1990s, you know, late 1990s. He spent a lot of time in the musty stacks looking at the same things I was looking at, but on computer.
Yeah, let's go into that for a moment then. So MacQuarrie was after he was writing at Superior. He worked his way up pretty rapidly until he was the editor, wasn't he?
He was managing editor, yes.
Yeah, and then he accepted this job for a first ever type of position as a regular writer of a sporting column, right, at the Milwaukee Journal in Milwaukee.
That's right.
What year was that, Dave?
So in 1936, and as I said, he was 36 years old, and Milwaukee made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He had a hard time leaving Superior. Right? Sure. I mean, you saw the map where he knew all this territory, and he had fun there and had a good job going, but he had a better job in Milwaukee. He had already, by that time, in 1936, he already had a national reputation. His magazine articles, his freelance articles, were published in Outdoor Life and Sports Afield and some of the magazines of that day as well, Field Stream. But they started in 1931. So by the time he got to Milwaukee, they knew they wanted him, and he also wrote some columns as a special journalist to them, or a special reporter to the Journal. So in fact, there's one in this book that predates his 1936 employment there. He would have gotten $10 for it or whatever he got. But so
this was really fascinating to me because I was a journalist at a daily newspaper in southern Minnesota for 7 years, and we had an outdoor writer.
Oh, yeah.
And I just assumed that there were always outdoor writers at daily newspapers. And so reading about this to know he was really the first professional outdoor writer at a newspaper.
That's right.
He sort of defined that whole field. That is really an interesting fact for anybody who's a writer out there, to know that he carved out this niche. And I was really surprised that there wasn't more of that outdoor writing going on earlier, just because we at least stereotypically, seemed more connected to the outdoors and nature, back in the 30s and 40s than we are now. So.
Yeah, very great point and great perspective. So it was in 36, and he'd been married for what by then, about 5 years?
They were married in 1927. Yeah.
And they had one child.
They had a daughter, a little redhead. Of course, Gordy was, he was a
He was
redhead himself,
Scotch
too. He was
descent.
Scotch, his Mr.
Scottish,
Peck.
I should say.
Scottish.
Scotch is a drink, Scottish is a...
Anyway, Mr. President was Scotch Presbyterian, and so was MacQuarrie. They were, in fact, they did attend the same church in Superior, and so anyway, when Sally, and there's one of his very early stories. He talks about this pink-haired urchin coming across the floor with made even sillier looking by her red bow in her hair, young Sally. So yeah, she was born in 29, so she would have been pretty young when they went
6,
to
7 years old at that time. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So then he went to Milwaukee, and he was at least as busy writing a daily column, that sort of thing. And he continued to write these specials in his spare time, right? And he was a prolific writer because how many columns? Now, in order, let me make clear where I'm going. This book that you have created, compiled, or whatever, at its basis, it is columns written for the Milwaukee Journal, as it was then known, correct?
Right.
And on behalf of the Barnes Area Historical Association, you got permission from the now Milwaukee Journal Sentinel organization to have access to the microfiche copies, and then you went through those, and out of thousands
Several
columns,
thousand. Yeah, you wrote for 20 years.
Called 60-some, is it?
80-some, yeah.
80-some to create this book.
Right.
That had to be such a difficult task.
Well, it wasn't difficult. Actually, the reading and the discovery is wonderful. It's fun.
But you had to pick.
Well, yes.
So there you are, the curator of a lot of great material and deciding what you're going to hold out.
What to put in, what to leave out, yeah.
And it wasn't digitized. These were
it's
photographic process that you had to read on that silly whatever.
Do they still have bound volumes that you could look through, the really old?
I didn't. I suspect Milwaukee might have, but I don't live in Milwaukee or close to Milwaukee.
Okay,
so it's, it was a process. I mean, there's no question it was a long process, but it was love. I mean, it was a process of love, and it was a process of fun. Now, putting the book together wasn't quite so much fun, but discovering, every day. And what I would do, Google, in its attempt to be all things to all people, actually put these columns, well, they have like 5,000 newspapers. They think that every newspaper in the world should be online, or at least that was their mission at the time. I think it's kind of slipped. But so the Milwaukee Journal was one of the newspapers they had online. So I was able to find, and well, I kind of found them by accident, but I was in the middle, and oh, well, that's there. Well, I wonder if there's another one. And finally, I went back to April 19th, 1936, his very first column, which is an interesting story in itself, and we'll get to it. But and just started working my way through it, and is, just find this one, find the next one, and.
So I'm curious if there's...
And check on which ones are really, really this kind of stuff, because there are a lot of daily news, a dog trial coming up, or this law just got passed, or the government is squabbling over, this outdoor event.
Is there anything now that you're like, I'm so sorry I didn't put in this one, now that I look back?
Well, not really. I mean, it's, there's always, I guess I shouldn't say not really. Yeah. There's one section in here I call Just Fun Stories, and that's getting at what you are alluding to, I think, that they were, they weren't really about Mr. President. They weren't about the Middle Eau Claire Lake, because some of the chapter, the first chapter is Superior People, and then we go to Yellow Lake, and then we go to Middle Eau Claire Lake, the kind of the headquarters places and Mr. President. But anyway, finally got down to, this is too good not to leave in, but for every one I put in, there's 10 that I know, and you aren't likely to get to know. I didn't have
Now,
room.
there's got to be some, a lot of topical overlap between his daily column articles and his
Magazine.
part-time magazine articles. And so you couldn't have done your work successfully without being intimately familiar with the articles that have been gathered in the 4 books from the magazine sources in order to avoid making them exactly the same or the like, right?
Well, there's quite a few. I think there's 18 stories in here that are what I call first drafts. They're columns. They're 700, 800, 1,000 words. So it's a column. It wasn't meant to be, whereas, of course, the magazines are 4 pages, 5 pages, 8 pages long with pictures and the whole thing. But they'd be where he had an idea and he wrote it up for the Milwaukee audience first and said, oh, that's a pretty good story. I think I can make some money on this one. And he'd go home and wordsmith and craft but you can find out, and the interesting thing for me, I like sleuthing, I like just finding out everything I can, is that I could then date the magazine stories, which are well known to many people, all of his followers, and say, well, that happened in such and such a day, such and such a place often, and such a date. So because the newspaper was current.
Tagged to it. Yeah. So previously published, there's of course not only Keith Crowley's biographical work, but over the years there have been 3, at least these 3 are the most famous volumes. I assume there's one that looks like this, but it just costs too much for me. So I got this one. Some of these, of course, are collector's items.
They're all getting to be collector's items, yes.
And these were done at different times by somewhat different publishers, and they picked up magazine articles, not newspaper columns, magazine articles, And so the true aficionados, have all of those read, but more than that, memorized. And then there's, of course, the miscellany, which is another set of things like that, right? So, and is there another book that I don't have in my collection?
Well, there are actually 2 more. There's the Treasury, and the Treasury has a lot of the Gordon MacQuarrie Sporting Treasure, I think it's called. And that's one you should buy for the library if you haven't yet, because it's kind of the best of series. It's $25 right now. It's a hardcover. It's bigger than any of these, and it's a nice book. It has, well, like I say, it has some of the best of. It has for the people who really know this.
It doesn't have stories that aren't in one of these others.
It does. Yes, it has that too. It has some additional stories as well, but it has the day I burned the oatmeal and the old brown Mackinaw. I'm telling this for people who
will recognize those titles.
For the 2% of the people watching this thing that know, but okay, maybe I should get a Treasury too. But that's
There's that. And what's the other one that I don't have?
He has Fly Fishing with Gordon MacQuarrie,
sure.
and and that one is, I mean, if you had all the other books, I think you'd have all the stories. I don't think that has any stories in it. I don't own it myself. It's another collector item book, but I've seen it once again through the library system. We got to plug the library system. It's out there if you want to see it.
That's how I read them all the first time.
Me too.
Then I started looking, for used copies.
Yeah.
Shelley, you bring a remarkable perspective here. So I'd like to ask you, if it's not putting you too much on the spot, when you started to read right off the reel, and as you got into a little bit, what were your impressions? What struck you?
Because, as a former newspaper person and a writer, I was thinking, well, we're talking 1930s newspaper. Traditionally, the writing was a little stiff. Or it would be at the other end where there was a sort of muckraking yellow journalism that was over the top. And so I was really struck by the conversational tone and the humor that I wasn't expecting to see in newspaper writing from the 30s and 40s, because the humor is tremendous. It's very funny.
Oh, yes.
But also there's some really poignant moments as well. And I think one of my favorites in here that I marked with my little tag is when his buddy and they went duck hunting and they brought their wives.
Oh, yes.
Oh,
yes.
And thinking, well, they'll be in the cabin fixing us dinner, but they decided to come out and hunt along with them. And I mean, it was just really.
They gave him a hard
Yeah.
time too, yeah.
He's sort of got on the domestic front a little bit of an Irma Bombeck sense of humor, and then. Since I'm not really much of an outdoors person, I was surprised how relatable that the columns were to me.
Oh.
So
that's
he,
interesting.
he does use jargon of hunting and shooting, but he uses it in a way that if that's not something you do, if it's not your passion, you still understand what he's talking about and why this is meaningful.
Interesting. Had you thought in those terms that I mean, we know MacQuarrie, or we respect MacQuarrie as an extremely skillful writer, but was he writing for the female audience, do you think, in an intentional way?
Well, actually, he has a few. I'm thinking of one article that isn't in the book, but that he wrote. He went out to South Dakota pheasant hunting, and he interviewed a woman out there who was, and South Dakota, and this would have been in the 40s. I'm trying to remember when it was, but
Mid-40s, post-war,
I think maybe even during the war, like 42, 43. But anyway, he, or maybe it was 45. Now that I think about it, it was 45. So it was the fall of 45. So the war was, the war was over, I believe. So anyway, but they actually had a buildup of pheasants, probably because so many hunters weren't there.
Sure.
And so they had, I can't remember, but millions of pheasants in South Dakota. And they had this one woman in this place that was cleaning ducks for pay. I mean, that was what she was doing. She'd do pheasants. She'd do 300 pheasants a night.
Whoa.
And he
He
wrote a story about it, and he said, I had to tuck this back in the sports page because if I put it up in the cooking page, the woman would tear it out and throw it away, that a woman could do this. So he kind of, and then his bottom line was something like, men, are you brave enough to show this to your wife? So something like that.
I really see a female attraction to the writing because, even though they weren't traditional female hobbies, these were their husbands, their brothers, and their fathers. And he isn't just writing about a sport, he's telling stories about people.
Very much so.
And they see the people they know in these columns. And so I think that's how it's relatable, because you would have the laugh thinking about your husband out in the duck blind. Am I using the right words there?
Sure.
Yes. With his buddies, and that this is what they would be doing and this is what they would be talking about. So I totally see that.
Yeah.
It wasn't maybe in the right section of the paper that they went to right away, but yeah.
Both of his wives were hunters and anglers. I guess both of his wives gets ahead of us a little bit, but Helen Peck.
Okay, fill us in.
Helen Peck did.
Followed him to Milwaukee.
Yeah.
Bring us up to the death of Helen then.
Well, we could. Yeah, I guess we can go there. The 40s were tough. He wrote wonderfully during the 40s because he was rationed on tires. He couldn't drive, and he loved to drive. Mr. President died in December of 1939, basically New Year's Day of 1940. And his wife and daughter
Both became ill.
Both became ill. They both had TB, and they were in the sanitarium. And he wrote like crazy during that time, but and ultimately he lost his wife in 1952, and he had some tough times. I mean, he used alcohol as a crutch. That was part of the times, and during the late 40s and early 50s, he didn't write much. He didn't write for the newspaper very much. He didn't write very much for the magazine. But then
And then in his later years, he
Then in
found
1953,
another woman, didn't he?
he got remarried, and he found the second Mr. President, and unfortunately, he died in 1956. He died pretty young, 56 years old. I mean, he could have had 20 more years worth of stories. We'd have books stacked up like this. But his new wife was also a hunter, and she brought him back to life in some ways, as did Harry Knorr, who's the second Mr. President.
Who was not related to MacQuarrie in any way.
No,
it wasn't
no,
his second
no.
wife's father or
It was
anything like
just
that. He
somebody-
was a postmaster in
Mineral
southwestern
Point.
Wisconsin.
Mineral Point, yes. And he was...
They met at meetings and such.
Yeah, they met. He was in the Conservation Congress, big wheel in the Conservation Congress. So they met in the annual meeting in Milwaukee, but then they met on dozens of trout, or thousands of trout streams. He said, I think he exaggerated a little on that, but on dozens of occasions elsewhere. So,
And MacQuarrie had hunted and fished in other parts of Wisconsin, as well as into the Dakotas and lots of other places. But through his acquaintance of the second Mr. President, he ended up spending a lot of time in the coulee country and in the trout streams that feed into the Mississippi.
Yeah.
And that was all interesting and informed his articles and his stories in other ways. There were, it seems to me, one should mention just, again, I hope we're not stealing your thunder, no, because you have so much to cover.
I have lots of thunder,
in the library. It seems to me there are two notable articles especially, or a series. The one is the Armistice Day storm, and the definitive article about that. Did you happen to read that?
I read that if you want to see the quintessential writing about that storm, that you need to look up his piece. And I was wondering if there's ever been a movie made about that. Because doesn't it just seem like the... could be a fruitful ground for some tremendous... But we need a few facts for the audience who might not be familiar with the Armistice Day storm. So let me turn to you, Dave, for that.
Sure. Well, it was 1940. It was that day, Armistice Day, November 11th. It had been a poor duck season. It had been too warm, and the ducks were all in Canada, and they weren't here yet. And it was... interesting. I think I alluded into it there, but 2 days before, so it would have been the 9th, there was a Milwaukeean who was hunting in South Dakota, and he said he saw 1 million ducks go over, and they printed it in the paper and went on about their way. So Armistice Day, or 1940, the meteorology wasn't what it is today, and they didn't know. And so all these...
the clothing, where...
Well,
you
they
have
did,
the special clothing.
But the day dawned warm.
It was beautiful.
Southerly breeze.
The day dawned warm, but nobody knew there was anything coming. They went out, and then they said, here comes the wind. Oh, good, we got ducks coming. And they did, and the ducks came in by the thousands. And people stayed just a little too late, and they lost. And the interesting thing, reading the paper itself, of course, was this was one of the stories, but the front page was covered with, duck hunters, again, in inland places close to Milwaukee, some of the inland lakes, or Winnebago. Great Lakes sailors at peril. Ships went down. And there was one little column, just local Milwaukeeans who were injured by flying debris or being blown off their feet and all that sort of thing. But there were, and I forget the number, it was dozens of hunters that died on the Mississippi. And it's, it's just a challenging...
It's one of the tragedies of hunting history.
It is, yes. Yeah.
And MacQuarrie wasn't over there on that side of the state at the time, right?
He was there in a hurry.
Rushed over.
He was there in a hurry,
knowing it was an important story.
So he and the writer in Winona, kind of teamed up, and they wrote, and actually the Winona paper reran that every year on Armistice Day for a long time. I don't believe they do now. And that's another one that has been made into a magazine story. It was a tale of caution in some ways. The week after, and I didn't put it in here, but I think I just alluded to it. The week after the storm, he talked about skiffs, and skiffs are
duck hunting skiffs.
Yeah, they're small. They're
boats.
they're not as wide as this table typically, and maybe 12 feet long, maybe not even that. And he said, instruments of death in the wrong place.
Yeah.
And that's of course what people had. They didn't. I mean, there weren't 90 horse and 220 horse and stuff that we'll see on the Mississippi today.
No, people used oars or canoes or poles. Right?
Yeah. And even if they had an outboard, you wouldn't trust it much, and they would freeze up. And so,
it was a setting for tragedy.
Yes.
And we have all of us, all of humanity has a skiff at the Barnes Area Historical Association, right?
That's true, yeah.
That was
that's
used
true.
by MacQuarrie
Yes.
and presumably by his honor, the
Yes.
first president. Can be seen and touched right there in the room that the Historical Association set aside for MacQuarrie memorabilia. Let's go to something a little later. And
Okay.
I'm thinking of the story of Gertie the duck.
Oh, okay. Gertie the duck,
Do you want to tell us a little bit about
Sure.
Gertie?
Well, this
and
was,
how
yeah,
that
Gertie
unrolled?
was, and she doesn't make this book, but we'll talk about Gertie anyway. Gertie was a female mallard, and she nested in downtown Milwaukee on the Milwaukee River in the spring of 1945. So once again, warriors, and we needed something light. And as Buck says, we got something light. So she started out, she laid some eggs on a series of pilings out just off the bridge, and ultimately, well, of course, a few people came to see that. Oh, that's kind of neat. There's a duck out there, and then a few people would start to harass her a little bit, throw pennies at her, or a couple of people threw burning cigarettes at her, and the bridge keepers adopted her. Basically, they because this must have been the lift bridge. It would have had been anyway. They had tenders, and so they adopted her. And MacQuarrie wrote a story 3-4 times a week. He'd write about another egg, and who came to see her. And well, Memorial Day was Memorial Day parade went over that bridge, and they had watchers out there, and every band that came by. You got to go by. Well, they did, and then she hatched out, and they got the ducks to the Juneau Park Lagoon. So yeah,
It was again. I guess it illustrates MacQuarrie's ability to write stories for all
human
readers.
interest. Yeah, well, that one definitely it was. I mean, that wasn't aimed at hunters. It was just aimed at people.
Hunters, fishermen, or
anybody,
or even the great themes of the times. And MacQuarrie was a contemporary, of course, of Aldo Leopold, Wisconsin's famous wildlife biologist, who died in 49, I think it was, right?
48 or 49, I can't remember.
48
But
in a prairie fire. Had a heart attack, apparently,
yeah.
while fighting the fire. But he and MacQuarrie often spent time together, went to meetings together. I suppose they hunted and fished together. They certainly exchanged views because MacQuarrie sympathetically set forth the views that Leopold was offering at the time. Is it fair to say that Leopold had this vision of managing of the game species with hunting as one of the tools for management, habitat preservation as another tool?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I have, and we're touching on another chapter in here, and that is what I called conservationists and writers. And there are 2-3 Leopold stories in here. One that your viewers would enjoy reading or seeing, I think, or learning about is, so Leopold and Starker, his son, were coming back from the shack, and people who know Leopold know the shack, and they know he was at the university. So they were coming back from the shack on a Sunday afternoon, going back to school or back to teaching. And the radio was blaring in the gas station. Of course, Sunday afternoon, well, it was the Packers, and he and Aldo and all his, I don't know, simplicity, whatever you want to call it, his dedication to his world, said, Starker, what are these Packers all about? So it was obvious that was, that was not his thing. He was somewhere else. But that's in this book too, that little story. And then he goes on to talk more about Leopold's philosophy.
I think we should say something about followers of Leopold and the Old Duck Hunters Association Circle.
Sure.
And the role of the Barnes Area Historical Association. I brought my certificate. When the Barnes Area Historical Association, well, let's back up a little bit and let's start with Thorson, with Dave Thorson.
Okay, sure.
Would you tell the folks about the first MacQuarrie pilgrimage, Dave, and the second and the third?
Well, Dave Thorson was a Renaissance man, I guess, out of the Barnes area. He actually grew up in the town I grew up, or I live in now, Cumberland, but he worked for the Forest Service out west, but he was a wonderful geologist, Indian historian in general, naturalist, just knew a lot of stuff. And he ran a little tour company out of, out of his home.
Outside Gordon,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, between Gordon and Barnes. So he was instrumental with this, the Barnes Area Historical Association getting together. In fact, he's written a wonderful, great big book about A Breath of Fresh Air, which is Barnes area and the founding of Barnes and the history of Barnes. Okay, you got it there?
Barnes, for people who don't.
Hard to find. Barnes is
It's not even named on this little map here.
It's kind of halfway between Hayward and Brule, so it's
a wide spot in the road, but it has the museum.
It has a museum, right, and the museum got going. Anyway, so Dave put together this tour, and there were over a dozen, I guess, about 14, 15 of us, and Buck was one of them, and I was one of them that went on that tour. And he took us to a lot of MacQuarrie places, and that was...
Places that are mentioned in the story.
Sure, and he would read a little blurb. And so that was the first. And then the next year, and Dave died.
In December that
very
year.
Young. I mean, well, not very young, but pretty young. Younger than I am now, probably younger than you are now.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But he died, and the museum wasn't ready yet to put on a pilgrimage, but they wanted to. And I stepped into the void and said, well, I'll do one. So I did one actually in very different territory, in Mr. President's territory, you could call it, more Washburn and Douglas and Burnett County.
And that was in August of 2017?
That would have been 17, yes.
So we timed it to August so that Keith could be there, if I remember right, and speak to us.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then, so by 2018, the Barnes Association was ready, and they were, actually several of them had come on that tour in 2017. And so they were ready, and so we put that on last fall. And I'm part of it. Buck was on that tour, but I was part of the...
Not a leader like you.
I was part of the tour leading, so yeah.
And we're planning that there will be one again this year, right?
There will. I think it's the Saturday after Labor Day is probably the easiest way to remember
Friday
it.
the 6th of September through Sunday the 8th, if you take in everything.
Yeah.
That'll be on offer.
Yes.
The Brits like to say. Hopefully the weather will be good so I can drive my MG again. Last year when I came back from the tour, it was a tremendous deluge. My poor MG got really wet. But anyway, the Barnes Area Historical Association decided they would not only sponsor the pilgrimages now, but they have the Old Duck Hunters Association Circle, which one can join for an annual fee. As soon as they announced it, I rushed and got number one. But Dave did even better because he bought the first life membership in the Old Duck Hunters Association Circle. And you know, at both levels, you get a cap. It says Old Duck Hunters Association Inc. And the Inc. stands for
Incorrigible.
Yeah, there we are. Yeah. So that's a great thing. And I think the membership's up to 100 or something, right?
Oh, I thought it was 35, but I don't know. Let me see. I suppose
seen the last.
your book doesn't have it. My books back there have a folder with.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I'm wondering about what you think about the shelf life of his work. You know, he's been dead for almost
Since
70
56.
years, and you know, he probably got even more famous. Do you think, with the biography and the compilations that came out? But
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you feel like the younger outdoor enthusiasts are aware of him and follow him.
Well, many people aren't, obviously, and that's part of what we're doing here. We're educating. Many people are. Quite a few of the people on the tour and quite a few of the people in the Old Duck Hunter Circle are younger people. They are embracing, and it's kind of a simpler kind of life. I mean, there is, and Leopold talked about gadgets, and one of MacQuarrie's pet peeves was gadgets as well. So that you're not out there to fill the bag the most efficiently you can. You're out there to enjoy life. I mean, that's the enjoyment is what it's all about. So, yeah, there is a Old Duck Hunters Association Facebook page, and most of those people, of course, are of the Facebook age, so they tend to be younger. It's not associated with the museum, although the museum needs to somehow insert themselves in there.
Link over, yeah.
But when this book came out, I mean, it was all over that Facebook page, and people were holding it up to the camera and see what I got for Christmas and all that stuff. So,
That's great.
and certainly the books are what carries him, because the magazines are musty, burned up, used for insulation, dead. You know, they're gone. They're hard. They're on eBay. I mean, and I bought quite a few, but they're hard to find. But the books are, as we said, are getting expensive, but they're always available through the library, right?
Yes.
So that's
You don't have to see money.
you don't have to spend the money. Come to the library, right?
When people come on the 2nd of April at 6:30 for your speaking, and you'll have the books for sale. And,
I will, yes.
And you'll autograph them for people.
I will, yes.
Will there be anything else to talk about?
Well, everything.
That's a rhetorical question.
Just everything we've talked about today, I guess.
I think it would
There's a
be
lot
great
more.
if you would read one of your favorites.
Well, what we will do,
Give that some thought.
what I will do is, or what I have been doing with libraries, is to actually bring enough books that I can hand them out to the audience, and go through the book. Because one of the things that most people wouldn't understand is, all these books are printed in runs of 1,000 or 5,000. This is printed in runs of 1. This is a print-on-demand book.
Yeah.
Oh.
So it is, we have no inventory. Well, I shouldn't say no inventory. We have little inventory. The museum has, 100 books at a time, and they order them. And if you order it, you can order it, well, 2 ways. You can order it through the museum, which is the way we prefer, because they make more money that way. But if you order it through Amazon, they make a royalty as well. So it's available both ways. Where was I going with this?
Well, I was going to say something while you're thinking about
Yeah.
that, and while you're getting ready to tell us the significance of April 19, 1936, that my understanding is that you did the deal with the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel to have access to their material and to be able to use it despite the copyright, so long as it was done for the Barnes Area Historical Association, and that you yourself are getting no compensation other than reimbursement of expenses.
Well, don't even get that.
There's
but
not even that.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'm
okay.
donating that
so
too.
There's
So
nothing for you in this
That's
very
true.
unusual situation.
Yeah, well, it's
Yeah, so let me say thanks on behalf of all
You're
the
welcome.
It's a
readers.
passion project.
It's a passion project, that's true, yeah.
Yeah. So what
Yeah.
happened on April 19th of 1936?
Well, that was his first day at the Journal, and he had a nice big picture on his front page, and he's a good-looking guy. I don't know which picture, probably that's the
Yeah,
best picture,
with
but
his
he's a good-looking
picture,
guy,
with
and
his
he was front and center on the Milwaukee Journal, our new outdoor editor. As you said, that's an important thing that they were, and this is such a Wisconsin, well, Wisconsin isn't alone, but Wisconsin is a hunting and fishing and conservation. I mean, John Muir came out of here, Sig Olson came out of here.
Leopold, as mentioned.
Leopold, of course.
All of Leopold's students.
Yeah,
who's
yeah.
Fanned throughout the
so
world.
this has been just a conservation hotbed for a long time. So Milwaukee knew that, and they hired the best, and they got him, and he showed up. He wrote about Gus and this big steelhead, and that was the story. And it's also in, I think it's in his first book, and it's also in the Treasury. It's a classic book of. And Goose was 6'4". He's even taller than me, big old Norwegian, and he went out there and caught the steelhead, and well, I don't know. We can give the story away, right? Anybody that knows it, but he held it up. I bet she goes 6 pounds, he says, and he dropped it. And everybody fell, and all of a sudden a big grin broke on Goose's face, and he says, I don't know, it was too daggone white for me anyway. So that was the story.
He was a character. And
Yeah.
he was a real guy. And you of course, have done
yeah.
a lot of research in the friends, the family, the connections.
Right,
It's
right.
astounding, Shelley, how he can rattle
Yeah.
off. And at some of the pilgrimages, at last year's banquet, for instance, a number of family relatives, people who had cottages also on Middle Eau Claire Lake, they were descendants of
Second and
Leopold.
third generation of his friends, yeah.
Does his cabin still stand?
His cabin stands. That's part of the pilgrimage. In fact, it's
Oh,
probably the
There are pictures of us standing in front of it.
the highlight of
Yeah.
the
First, and
of
second,
the-
and third pilgrimage. Yeah,
yeah. Well, actually, which one? This one would have
it has a picture of it in there
picture of the
also.
cabin or somewhere, if we can find it.
This
So I
around
don't know
this whole area are
which
some
pho-
friends.
or which
Yeah.
camera to show it to, but there's
to
the
that one.
camera, and there's the fireplace.
There's an interesting story about the construction of it. I don't think we'll go into it now, but somebody might want to ask that question at the author's
Yeah.
event.
Well,
And
it's
maybe
very
someone will make a note about that.
Well, maybe someone named Shelley will make
Yeah.
a note about that. It's a possibility.
well, it's very much it is a story in here too about how they constructed it. So yeah.
Yeah. Anything that we need to say here, knowing
Well,
that there's
nobody
another
ever
chance on April
Nobody
5th?
talked about the price of this book. It's $18,
Oh,
and if you get it through directly from the Barnes Museum, it'll be $21, $3 shipping. If you get it from Amazon, I think it's basically the same, but and it's about well, actually the museum could get it to you a little faster because they open their mail every day and send them out. They do have a stash there, but for the Amazon world, with the print on demand, they would send it off, and it's actually Create Space was who printed it. They're an Amazon subsidiary, but they would, they'd put it in the queue and send it over and say, print one of these, and they'd ship it. So it'd still be, I mean, you wouldn't know that they didn't have it on the shelf. It'd be 7 days.
Or you could come to the
8 days.
library.
Or you could come to the
on
library.
April
Well, I
2nd.
Right.
but if somebody wanted to read it in advance or
Yeah.
something like
Yeah,
that, the title again is Right Off the Reel,
Mm-hmm.
and it's billed as by Gordon MacQuarrie because originally he wrote the stories, but Dave Evanson is the guy who compiled them all and did all the hard work of. You practically had to keyboard every single character, didn't
Right.
you? 'Cause
Not practically had to. I did have to.
Yeah, exactly, because it wasn't machine readable or character recognizable,
Right.
any of that kind of stuff. So let's see, we want to be sure to say thanks to Dave Evanson
Thanks for
who's our
coming.
author.
Okay.
Shelley Tugas, who's our star librarian and the
This was
arranger
fun. Thank you.
Yeah.
of author visits at the Hudson Area Joint Library. And restate again, it's April 2nd at 6:30, from 6:30 to 8 at the Hudson Area Joint Library, where the presentation will be. Questions will be answered. You can try to stump Dave, but I predict, folks, you'll have a hard time stumping him. He is a fountain of knowledge on Gordon MacQuarrie, as well as a lot of hunting and fishing stuff related to his DNR years in the northwest corner of Wisconsin. The Indian Head, as he calls it.
The Indian Head.
So, for Northwest Journal, Buck Malick, signing off.